Hi, I'm Professor Mike Wood from the University of Salford, and I'm going to explain to you why many of the Chernobyl radiation effects studies that you may have seen published are in fact wrong. At the time of the accident back in 1986, there was a very significant release of radioactive contamination into the environment, and the radiation dose rates at that time in areas such as this area of the Red Forest caused death of pine trees, undoubtedly death of small mammals and other organisms within those locations. Since the accident, as we've moved into more of a chronic exposure phase, we have very conflicting reports as to the extent to which radiation is impacting on the environment. Here you have two newspaper articles or two news articles from the BBC. One which says that species in Chernobyl are in decline and that decline is linked to DNA. The other that says wildlife are defying Chernobyl radiation, saying it has become a haven for wildlife. These are two very contrasting views, and to be perfectly honest, this controversy is probably the most significant source of scientific debate within the sphere of radioecology currently. Many different groups use Chernobyl as a natural laboratory. We have done so over many years through things like this major program of research, the Tree Project, that brought together all of those different institutions whose logos you see in front of you here. And we used Chernobyl as a natural laboratory to study the aquatic environment, the terrestrial environment, a huge range of different organisms. If you want to learn more about the Tree Project, you'll see there's a web link available on this slide, and there's also a YouTube link which will take you to a video that explains more about the research that we did as part of the Tree program. As I say, many other groups have used the exclusion zone as a natural laboratory as well, but what we do find is we find these contrasting perspectives on the extent to which radiation is impacting on the Chernobyl environment. It's fairly easy to see why people would choose to use Chernobyl as a natural laboratory. It's one of the few locations in the world where we have a real gradient of radiation levels and wild populations existing in this environment. It's also an environment from which people are largely excluded, and as a result of that, it really does provide opportunity as a natural laboratory. But we've got to get our interpretation of radiation effects studies in Chernobyl correct. Such studies inform guidance, practice, policy surrounding the development of environmental radiation protection. We need to ensure that when we draw conclusions from our Chernobyl effects studies, that they are firm, robust conclusions. There are various different issues with the way in which conclusions are drawn from field effects studies in Chernobyl, and things that we need to recognise when trying to interpret the results that people report. One of the factors that we need to consider is that if we're doing ecology-based studies involving humans going into an environment and undertaking observations, those humans actually introduce a disturbance factor into that environment, which may, of course, affect the extent to which we can observe different types of organisms in that environment. Also, if you are subject to unconscious bias, it's actually very hard to ignore the alarm going off on your radiation dosimeter telling you that you're in a high radiation level versus low radiation level. What we've tried to do within our studies is capitalize on the use of novel technologies that allow us to undertake studies of wildlife in these environments in a way that minimizes our disturbance, that gives results which others can independently verify, and collects data in a way which we can ask people to review and come to conclusions on without any knowledge of the radiation levels from which those different data were obtained. So we've made extensive use of motion activated camera traps and also of acoustic recorders. We deploy these into the environment, they capture data, we bring those data back, and the data can be analysed blind. So this really does help to increase the robustness of the science that we undertake. We can also make those data openly available, and indeed we're passionate about doing so, and again this helps to ensure that others can independently verify our results. Another consideration when it comes to looking at radiation effect studies on wildlife in the Chernobyl exclusion zone is the fact that we must recognise that the dose rate that an organism is exposed to is a combination of both the external dose rate and the internal dose rate. This is something which is all too often overlooked. And if you look at one of our previous studies within the zone, where we actually quantified the relative proportions of internal and external dose rate, you'll see here the black bars indicating external dose rate are in some cases less than 50% of the internal dose rate. In all cases, internal dose rate is clearly an important thing to consider. You also can't use just a simple estimate of external exposure based on an ambient dose measurement, because as you can see across those different organism types, the contribution of the external relative to the internal differs. Now, some studies may use an ambient dose rate measurement and then supplement this with a direct measurement of the cesium-137 activity concentrations within the organisms under investigation. People argue that this then allows them to consider both the external and the internal dose rate. But unfortunately, if you look at this figure in which we actually quantified the relative contributions of different radionuclides to the internal dose rate, you'll see that cesium actually only contributes up to a maximum of 50% of the internal dose rate, and in many cases it's much lower than that. By far the greatest contributor that we see here is strontium-90. So for studies that only quantify the internal cesium activity concentration, again there is a great element of uncertainty in the dose rates that are actually then being quoted for the organisms under investigation. At the University of Salford, we have developed a new detector which has been purpose designed to allow us to live monitor organisms that we're considering within our research. This detector is what we've coined the ROS detector, the radio analysis of small samples detector, and we've used this over 2 different field seasons within the exclusion zone. We've used it to study small mammals from both the red forest area, that highly contaminated forest very close to the reactor complex, and from other sites across the zone. If we look at the results that have come from the 2 field seasons, and we compare ambient dose measurements made using a handheld dose measurement device held in the environment to just take an ambient dose measurement, and we compare that with the results that we get from ROS, allowing us to calculate a total dose rate for the organisms under investigation, we see that actually there is very little agreement, as in we get an R squared of barely above 0 for a linear fit relationship here, very little agreement between ambient dose rate and total dose rate. So you simply can't use ambient dose rate as a proxy for total dose rate in this instance. You'll also maybe note that actually our highest dose rate that we saw as a total dose rate within the small mammals was at an ambient dose rate which was round about 30 microsieverts per hour. So well below some of those upper dose rates that you see. And for each ambient dose rate, you'll see there's quite a broad spread of different total dose rates. So for this reason, it's really important that any study which is attempting to quantify radiation effects on wildlife in the zone and construct dose effect relationships, they have to undertake an analysis that allows them to quantify both internal and external exposure. There are some other key things to consider. One of them is the fact that there is a dose history which impacts on the results that we observe currently. So places like the red forest, which had a very high acute exposure shortly after the accident, and then we may visit them at this time now. So we've got a red bar to the left around the accident time, red bar to the right as a present time. You can see that there's obviously been a very dramatic drop-off in dose rate. And if we just consider what the dose rate is at this point, we ignore the fact that this is a system which has been perturbed by a much higher dose rate in the past. If we compare that with a system where there was just an ongoing chronic exposure, we may come at this point and consider both of these systems and say, oh yes, well, it's got the same dose rate, it's a comparable system, but actually it's not. One has had a much greater disturbance level in the past as a result of radiation exposure. We also need to consider other stressors. So within the exclusion zone, forest fires are extremely common, and forest fires obviously will affect the wildlife populations. Another key factor not to be overlooked is the human disturbance factor. The zone has a history of human disturbance, and also it has an increasing level of tourism. Now, the red forest area, where most people use for their high contamination sites, also happens to be right next to Pripyat, a key destination for those tourists, and really close to the reactor site where a lot of industrial activity is still ongoing. So unsurprisingly, we'll find high levels of human disturbance currently, which we may anticipate would also affect the wildlife that we see in the vicinity of those areas. So the bottom line is, unless there is appropriate consideration of the total dose rate to organisms and of these other confounding factors that we've discussed, the conclusions from many of the Chernobyl radiation effects studies remain questionable.